The goal of a disciple is to become like the master. We become more like Jesus when we're intimately connected to him. And that's God's goal for our lives. So let's be honest, you can have the dream job and still come home feeling empty at the end of the day. You can have the boyfriend or the girlfriend or the marriage and still feel profoundly lonely sometimes. You can have everything the world tells you that you ought to have, success and stuff and money and approval, and still feel like you're not winning, you're losing to something you can't even name. That's real. It's real that sometimes we reach out for the good life and it feels like it just slips through our hands like water. And so we're going to spend some time talking about the good life. The life that God says we're actually made for. And this series is for anyone who's ever felt any of that stuff before. This series is also for anyone who feels like they could use a little bit more love or joy or peace or patience or kindness or goodness or faithfulness or gentleness or goodness in their lives. You know anyone who would want that stuff? If you do, great news. The Bible tells us that's the fruit that grows in us when we begin to follow Jesus as his disciples. So what we're going to discover over the course of this series is that the good life is found in following the one who gives us life. And we're going to talk about what that means and what that looks like by digging into the stories of some of the different disciples in the New Testament. And I think when we hear New Testament disciples, we generally think of the 12 guys that Jesus handpicked, but there were a lot more than that. There were over 100 people during Jesus' lifetime following him, walking with him, listening to his teaching, and trying to become his apprentices. And we're going to hear some of those stories as we begin to discover what the good life actually looks like and how we can grab hold of it. And this morning, before we jump into their stories, I just want to lay a foundation for this series by asking the question, what does it mean to be a disciple? And simply, without any biblical background or any outside context that we're bringing to it, a disciple is a disciplined follower of a master. How many of you guys have ever seen Star Wars? All right, that's a lot of you. The rest of you who haven't seen Star Wars, you want to see Star Wars. It's a really stupid joke because for everyone I was trying to convince, the Jedi mind trick means nothing. But anyways, in Star Wars, what you got is a Jedi master and a Padawan, a student and a teacher. And what happens is they kind of do life together, and the Padawan watches the master Jedi and becomes more and more like the master Jedi and learns to use a lightsaber like the Jedi until that Padawan grows up and becomes a master himself and then takes on a student, a Padawan, to teach. That's a discipleship relationship. And so a discipleship relationship is about becoming like the one whom you're following. You know, at Revision, we say all the time, we exist to help people meet Jesus and follow him fully. That's our mission. And it's kind of a modern way of saying we exist to help people become disciples, because that's what we're meant to do. That's what you're meant to be. But I think it gets complicated sometimes because we misunderstand that word. It's a super churchy word. If you grew up in or around church, you've heard the word discipleship a lot. But often what happens is that word gets connected, and probably this happens in any faith tradition that you come from, whether you grew up Catholic or Lutheran or Baptist or Pentecostal or atheist from the outside looking in. Often discipleship gets connected to knowing a lot about Jesus, doing Bible studies, learning theological concepts other people can't even pronounce. Like you do that and you're nailing it at being a disciple, right? Maybe. I can tell you this though, the emptiest and driest my faith has ever felt happened during my second year of grad school while I was studying the Bible in Greek and Hebrew. I was reading all these giant leather-bound books written by dead Germans. And some of you feel like death would be found in reading giant leather-bound books by dead Germans. But I could nerd out on like Pannenberg and Bonhoeffer all day long. But while I was reading them, I felt like something was missing in my faith. I was just dry in the middle of that season. And my guess is that some of you know exactly what that feels like. Maybe some of you are in that season right now. You're going through all the right motions. You're checking the right religious boxes and doing the right stuff. And yet somehow something in you is crying out like, is this it? Is this all that faith is meant to be? Because I feel empty. And let me throw this out there. Maybe you feel empty because this isn't all there was meant to be. And don't get me wrong, learning about Jesus matters. It makes a huge difference. It's something worth pursuing all our lives. It's the reason we call this church Revision. We are chasing constantly a bigger, better vision of who God is and who he created us to be. But you can have all the right information and still epically blow up your life, right? Every one of us knows people who have done it. You can memorize John 3:16 in the original Greek and still feel completely empty in your faith. I promise you can do that. I've done it. And during that season in seminary, it forced me to look inside and have a reckoning with where my life was at. And what I realized was that all the learning I was doing about Jesus and all the Bible reading I was doing so that I could write academic papers about it had kind of gotten in the way of me just spending time with Jesus and me cracking open the Bible just to hear God's voice. And if you looked at my life from the outside, you'd be like, wow, Mike is killing it at discipleship right now. But I wasn't. And it wasn't that all the learning was bad. It was just that the connection had gone missing. And without the connection, it's really, really hard to follow a master or to become like him. And I think we can learn that from the earliest followers of Jesus. There are a bunch of people who are eyewitnesses to his life and his death and his teachings and his resurrection. And they took what they saw and decided, even in the face of persecution and death, they were going to spread that message to the entire globe. They gave birth to the greatest movement this planet has ever seen, this thing called the church, which completely rerouted the future of humanity. And most of them were illiterate. They were uneducated and unimportant. They didn't read big books with names no one can pronounce. They just listened to teaching about Jesus and then walked out the door and put it into practice in their lives. They followed him and they obeyed. They didn't just do Bible studies. They did Bible studies and then they turned those into Bible doings. And they started taking steps behind Jesus. They followed. And in the process, they found meaning and beauty and the good lives their souls were longing for. So at the core, being a disciple is about obedience. Following Jesus means obeying him. Because look, I think we all know this is true. You can know very little about Jesus and do a whole lot with it that radically transforms your life and makes a difference in the lives of the people around you. And you can know a whole lot about Jesus and do nothing with it and see nothing change in your life. It's almost like the power is in the application, because it is. It's a really simple math equation. Information plus application equals transformation. That's what Jesus was after when he continually looked at people and said, not learn about me, but follow me. And so if we're going to take him seriously, and for real, if we're going to grab hold of the good life he promises us, he says, I came that you may have life and you may have it abundantly. If we're going to grab hold of that, then we have to follow him, and we have to be pretty honest with ourselves about the areas in our lives right now where we're really not following him that closely. And that's what we're going to do in this series. And I'll warn you right up front, I'm going to say some stuff that might make us uncomfortable. Even those of us who've been in church for a really long time. It'll be straight from the Bible, but it won't be easy to hear because it's stuff maybe you haven't thought about in a long time. Not intentionally, just accidentally, because that's what happens when we get into a routine of faith and a routine of just following Jesus and going through the motions. Sometimes I think we become so familiar. Like it's just so common for us to hear the churchy words and hear the Bible stories. We become so familiar that we end up unfamiliar. For example, we like to paint the story of Noah's Ark on the walls of kindergarten classrooms in churches. And we're like, look, isn't it precious? There's elephants and monkeys and giraffes on there sailing on the sky blue water. And you know what's underneath the sky blue water? All the other elephants and giraffes and monkeys that are dead. And most of the human beings who God in his holy wrath had to wipe out because of their violence and their horribleness to each other. Look closely, you might see a floating, bloated dead body. Like, that's an intense story for toddlers. Sometimes we get so familiar that we become a little bit unfamiliar. What we're going to do in this series is hopefully poke at some of those spots where we've gotten a little bit too unfamiliar. And my hope too is for those of you who are new to following Jesus, or for those of you who've been following for a long time and believe, man, I can never fully be a disciple. I can never get all the way into it because I just don't love reading giant books. Hopefully the series will be encouraging because you don't have to read those books. That's not what it looks like. Discipleship is as simple as your next step of obedience. It really is. It's about following. That's what Jesus told his disciples in the book of John, chapter 15. So if you got a Bible handy, you can crack it open to John 15. If you don't have one, no worries. The words are going to be on the screen. And if you need a Bible, or your kids do, we're so convinced at Revision that God speaks to us and changes our lives through that book that we have a bunch of free Bibles on a bookshelf in the prayer room right outside those doors for all different ages. Take what you need before you leave today. But this is what's going down in John 15. Jesus can see the cross coming. He knows what's going down. No one else has any idea what the future holds. But Jesus knows pretty soon he's going to die for your sins and mine. He's going to rise again and unlock death from the inside. And then he's going to ascend back into heaven and leave the mission of telling every person on this planet what he's done for them in the hands of his followers. And so he wants to teach them what it looks like to be disciples. And one day they're walking through a vineyard. And Jesus looks at the grapes growing on the vines and realizes this is a perfect moment to teach them something about what it looks like to follow me. And this is what he says starting in verse 1. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I don't know if any of you caught this. It was real subtle by the Lord there, but there was one word that he kept saying. Remain. Remain, 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 remain. Remain in me and your life will bear fruit. And so I think what Jesus wanted to be clear about was if we want to grow the character of Jesus, we have to stay connected to Jesus. If we want to grow the character of Jesus, we have to stay connected to Jesus. The goal of a disciple is to become like the master, and we become more like Jesus when we're intimately connected to him. And that's God's goal for our lives.